everyone, and welcome to another episode of God Is Not a Theory with Ken Fish. I'm your host, Grant Pemberton, and on today's episode, we have with us returning, which is wonderful. We've done this before. We have returning guest John Thomas, along with, obviously, Ken Fish. And John is the head of Streams Ministries and does a lot of really fun things. And apparently you guys just did something a couple weeks ago together, you and Ken. So I'm excited to dig in and hear all about all that.
Yeah. So John, welcome to the show. This is like, just saw you the other day, except now I'm seeing you on Zoom instead of in person. For those who did not perhaps hear the last time John was on with us, he's the head of Streams Ministries, as Grant said. Streams was founded by the late John Paul Jackson. And after John Paul's untimely death, John Thomas was asked by the board to become its leader. And he's been guiding it ably now for, I guess, nearly 7 years, or maybe you passed the 7-year mark.
Yeah, right under 7 years, actually. I took over about a year after he passed away. So he passed over about 7.5 years ago.
Yeah. So John's based in the Dallas area. And so I figured we would start talking today, maybe on business, because we recorded a podcast recently with another individual who's working in the area of business, and what does it mean to be a Christian in the marketplace. And so you and I jointly spoke through at a conference that I think was under the auspices of Streams, although a church, that specific church hosted it. Not too far from San Antonio, Texas. And I could say the town, but many wouldn't know that, but people would recognize San Antonio. But anyway, the church is called Cross Kingdom Ministries in Kerrville, which is in the hill country of Texas. And John and I were there with a couple of other business leaders, one of whom I think is very closely associated with Streams and attends the church that you lead there. And so anyway, I want to talk a little bit about that conference. What are your thoughts, a week or so after it's ended, and what were your key takeaways? And then, we'll move on to some other things as well.
Yeah, man, it was a lot of fun. One of the really interesting things that it's always encouraging when you don't sit down with the speakers ahead of time, and every message just kind of takes the last message like it was the intended follow-up. Here's application. Well, here's what this looks like. And it was one of those events where the Holy Spirit was clearly ordaining what was going on. So I'm very encouraged with the level of unity and understanding that was there, because I've had a lot of conversations. Brian Barnett is the guy that he's on our board here at Streams, close friend of mine. He was one of the other speakers, business owner here in Dallas. And we've had a lot of conversations about the need to get rid of this sacred secular divide and just getting to this understanding that Christianity is something that affects every aspect of life. And that was assumed by everybody that was speaking in a way that's not always the case.
Right.
Especially when you're mixing business people and people in ministry, because sometimes people in ministry, they have this idea that a ministry calling is a higher calling or a better calling than any other calling, instead of recognizing that the highest calling is whatever calling God has given you, that is actually your highest calling. And that was an encouraging piece. And I wonder, and I hope that it's actually broader than just that event. I know we had a very specific subsection with the people that came to that because of who heard about it and who was there. But it's such an important concept that it is. I think it's what was intended by some of the stuff that came out of the emphasis on the 7 mountains, where that 7 mountains, 7 spheres, whatever we want to call that. I think what was intended by that was just breaking down that wall and reminding Christians that we're supposed to be leaven wherever we find ourselves, And if we can get back to that, then we don't have to have such an emphasis on what sphere or what mountain. We just figure out how to be Christian wherever we are, instead of putting being Christian into the box of the church.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. Back on the comment you made about the 7 mountains, I like the idea of the 7 mountains, although I've said before, I'm not sure that it's only 7 mountains. I think there may be more than 7. 7, of course, is a important number in Scripture, and Rome was a city built on 7 hills, and it is said that Jerusalem also has 7 hills. So I think people, they kind of gravitate to this, but I think there are more than 7 mountains. And anyway, I'll just leave it at that. But the thing that I notice in most of the 7 mountains teachings that I hear, as inspiring as they are, they're very high level. And one of the things I learned when I was leading corporate strategy for 2 different Fortune 500 companies, I didn't do it simultaneously, but from one and then the other. In that role, one of the things that I learned is that good strategy is very detailed. It is very tactical. It is not, you just get these big pictures and, sort of drawing flow charts. It might begin there, but if you're a good strategist, you have to boil it down to, so in this month of this year, we're going to do this. And, in 2 years, we're going to open a plant there, and we're going to need this much capital to do it. And it's very, very operationally focused. And what I liked about the conference that we had, everybody kind of had that big picture vision, but we were trying to figure out, how do we give people things they can do, they can work on, that will make this implementable in their lives.
Yeah. And I mean, if you don't have the next step, how are you going to get to your destination?
That's right.
Too often we're trying to figure out how we're going to live in destiny that may not happen for a decade, and we haven't figured out how to live in today. But the only way you can get to tomorrow is by being faithful today. If you're not faithful today, you're going to repeat today.
That's right.
And that is one of those things. I think it was really brought out well. And I mean, it's one of the beautiful things about doing it with 2 business owners that actually live this out. This is not theory. This is actually practice, and have actually had to work through it over decades of leading businesses. I mean, very practical, very hands-on in their approach, because they're not talking about something that they haven't done. They're actually they're talking out of their lived experience, and that really makes a difference. Somebody once said that those who can't do it teach, which I think that's actually a really bad idea. I think that we need to have teachers that are practitioners, but in practice, that's very much the case in too much of this. And thinking through the implications of what this means. I mean, so I'm not in business at this time. I've been in business. I never owned a business. But what I'm doing in many ways is trying to figure out how to actually lead a church, lead a ministry simultaneously, but do it in such a way that I'm not taking business practices and trying to apply it to the kingdom. And I'm not trying to use religious jargon as an excuse to not be practical and use wisdom, but I'm actually bringing those 2 things together. I'm looking at what I can see that actually carries wisdom in the world around us, what has the echo of God, distill it to what was actually God, and then from that begin to build frameworks. So I'm actually doing what we're talking about, but I'm applying it in this setting. But the application is not that important individually it is, but the principles that we talk about when we're bringing the kingdom to bear into situations, and specifically whatever realm of authority that we have, whether that authority is in our families, in our churches, in our friendships, in our businesses, in the movies that we're in, or in the music that we're playing, bringing that authority under the authority of the king and thinking through the practical implications of it in every way. to me, that is the definition of discipleship, and we've really missed that in the church.
Yeah, it's kind of a known factor in the executive recruiting community that usually, if you want to get your best players for an organization, you do not recruit in the nonprofit and church sector. And it has to do with the fact that there is not as much detailed planning. There's not as much focus on execution. If it's a week late, who cares? Maybe in some bigger churches that wouldn't be as true, but the culture in the nonprofit world is often much more lax.
Yeah.
And in business, you're usually against some deadline. A loan is going to come up for renewal. You've got a customer order that's got to be fulfilled. Your competitor is releasing some product that you don't have an answer for, and the R&D team needs to be doing something about that. And I could go on. I'm just giving a few examples, but the bottom line is, with business, there's a kind of urgency that we often don't see. One of the things that I personally feel a great, desire to see happen is for Christians to up their game.
Yeah.
And I would say that's true in the workplace. I'd say that's true in the church place. I think it's true everywhere. Part of the unintended consequence of a culture of grace is that we often give people breaks that, it's good not to be hard-nosed and obnoxious, but maybe they don't need those breaks. Maybe they need to be encouraged to excel and to work a little harder and to pull the late night if they need to do it, et cetera, all of that. Yeah. And I think what we saw at this conference was two people who have been successful, but not without challenges. They both were pretty open about the challenges they went through and their own process of growth, which we can call discipleship, as they came along as Christian business owners from being where they were to being, where they are with, I would call, scale enterprise level businesses.
Yeah. That whole thing of in the church not taking things as seriously, deadlines and what you were just talking about. Yeah. That is, to me, that comes back to discipleship. Like I'm on this theme for probably 5-10 years, and really thinking through discipleship and what that means in so many different levels. But thinking through the implications of the things that we believe. There's a phrase, I think it's in the Message Bible, I can't remember, I think it's in Galatians. If this is true, how then should we live? If these things are true, how then should we live? Like, that question right there should be a constant question that we're coming back to as believers and thinking about every aspect of our life. So this is, related to business, but thinking about deadlines and what that actually means. So if God is a God of excellence, he actually does things well, and he is thought, he actually thinks through things. He's not just, I'm going to do this, I never even thought about it. So if that is true, if he is able to strategize creation. He waited until there was dry land before he created animals to walk on the land. He waited until there were people to cultivate the land before he caused large trees so that they would be able to support the growth. Like there were all these connections as strategy. Then what does that mean for my life? What does that mean for how I live? And as a believer, that thing of worship and the excellence and the beauty and the character of God then needs to become an implication in the decisions that we make. Right. And that the phrase, well, it's just the church, it's good enough. It is one of those things. It makes me want to scream and throw things. Like when I was in construction, and I'd have somebody on the crew would say, "Well, it looks good from my house," and it was like it's one of those things. No, wait a second. So this is an excuse to be lazy. Right. This is not actually worship. And so how could we change that? Because the reality is when a Fortune 500 company is looking to recruit, they should be trying to beat down the doors of the church to find people, because they're people that are actually excellent. They're good at what they do, and everything they put their hands to flourishes, like a Joseph, like a Daniel. We use these examples, but we're talking about hardworking people with high ethics that had high capacity and accomplished astounding things because of their wisdom and their strategy. And it was revelation, but much of their success was not actually because of revelation. Revelation was just part of their process because of who they were in relationship to God. Their success was because they actually lived out what they said they believed. And if we as believers started doing that, man.
Yeah. We can make a word play and say their success wasn't from revelation, it was from perspiration.
Yeah.
Except it may not be manual labors, in which case they may not be actually perspiring. But yeah.
I would like to stick here on what you guys are saying and just kind of like see if I can get some insight. I'm thinking about, potential ministry leaders that are listening to this, church leaders that are listening to this. One of the things I think that might be involved in maybe the lack of drive or, whatever is the lack of clearly defined measurables. And, how do they actually define success? You're always told in the church, you can't, don't measure nickels and noses. And, but then it's just like, well, how do we measure whatever, And so I'd just be like, pretty interested to hear what you guys think as ministry leaders yourselves, how can they begin to start thinking towards more dynamic ministry and growth and all of that sort of, do you guys have any thoughts on that?
You're our guest, John. You go first.
Okay. Yeah. Cause I've got a few thoughts, but I was going to give you a moment. So one, measurables are so key. I mean, we just, we have a regular staff meeting. Our operations manager runs the staff meeting. I'm just in there once a month. But in it, we have clearly defined goals that everybody on staff, there are things that they're looking at, that they're measuring, that are related to what they're doing. It's specific to their roles, and that is giving us a clarity on how they're stewarding what they have. And so they bring those numbers every single week and share them with everybody, and then explain the ups and the downs. Like, is there a reason why? Like, there could be a reason why this number is not as good, but we're still being successful because of this. And so we not only bring those measurables, we also bring testimonies. What's a win? What win are you bringing? And, we're looking for what's the activity of God that's involved in this, because we want growth and we also want activity of God. And when they come together, there's key. I mean, you look in the book of Acts, they have numbers, right? About 3,000 were added. The number of the believers were about 5,000. Like, they weren't like granular, but they were very detailed. And throughout the history of the scripture, there were clear numbers. And I think that the idea of nickels and noses, when that becomes the fruit, the only thing that we're looking at, because we're trying to make sure that we're paying our bills because we're greedy, or because we're trying to grow our church because we have ego, though that's bad. But if we don't care how many people are showing up, there's a problem. I don't care about all the people that are not here. I only care about the ones that I already have. Well, we're not allowed that. Go and make disciples. We're supposed to be multiplying. We're supposed to bear fruit. I chose you, John chapter 15, so that you would go and bear fruit, and that fruit would remain. What's the fruit? The fruit are the things that we've done, but it's seen in the lives of the people. And I may be able to help one person, and that's astounding. But if I can help 10 people, and those 10 people are helping 10 people, and those 10 people are helping 10 people, now all of a sudden I got 10,000 people that have been changed versus 100 people. And that completely changes the dynamic, because we're supposed to be making disciples. So as soon as we say that we don't care how many people are here, we're saying that we don't care about all the lost people that aren't in the room. So it's not an issue of the activity, it's an issue of the heart. And we're coming back to the Sermon on the Mount. It's not about nickels and noses, it's about changed lives. And if I'm looking at the number of people and the number and the amount of money, and that's my only concern, there's an issue. But if I'm looking at that because it's giving me an idea of what I'm doing and the fruit that I'm bearing, and it's really about the changed lives, and I can look at it and say, you know what, numbers are down, but I'm being faithful. Okay, I've got revelation, I'm doing what I've said, and the crowds are leaving, then I'm still okay with that. But if I'm just doing what I think I'm supposed to do, and I don't have revelation, then I need something that I'm looking at. And so it's holding that intention. Like there's the both and. I think we too quickly throw away that idea. I have to look at, I've got books that I'm supposed to be writing. I've got 3 of them that I've started, and I'm being confronted with this right now in my life. So this is fresh, where I'm actually still struggling through this, where I am putting onto my calendar time that I am writing, and I'm going to determine whether or not I'm being obedient to what God said by how many pages get written. I have to have something measurable. I have to be able to look at it. I'm actually doing what God said that I'm doing. I had a friend of mine that was called to be a full-time evangelist. Like God told him, you're supposed to be a full-time evangelist. And so he said, well, if I'm supposed to be a full-time evangelist right now, I'm going in, I'm clocking in 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week. He clocked in 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week, every single week. And he went out on the streets and he preached the gospel. And he would continue if he was having fruit, but he would do it no matter what he felt like and what he thought, because that's what God had called him to do. He had something very measurable that he was looking at. And I could talk to him. I mean, he's passed away now, but when he was around, I'd talk to him, and there would be story after story after story after story of fruit. And some of it from those times where he wasn't feeling led, he was just doing it because he was trying to be faithful and make sure that he'd set his benchmarks, like this is what faithfulness looks like, and he was matching that, and God showed up in the middle of it.
No, that's great. I think that's really helpful to hear. Yeah, that's awesome.
I think,
what do you think?
I think there are a lot of times when people hear this kind of talk, though, in the church, they become very defensive because they're threatened. I can remember some years ago being in a church where I didn't say it the way John said it, but I was expressing similar sentiments. And one particular woman became extraordinarily defensive and said, well, Jesus loves us anyway, and he's not a taskmaster and all of that. And I was like, well, yeah, but he did say he's looking for 30, 60, and 100-fold return. That means he's measuring something. And, I note with some interest that in the book of Acts, it says that, on the day of Pentecost, about 3,000 were added to their number that day. It's not a precise number, but it gives you a sense of the range, probably because they couldn't go around and count noses. If they could have, they might have done so. And then a little bit on from that in Acts, it says, and the number of disciples grew to 5,000. So somebody was taking note of these things. And John, you made a comment that I thought was really important, and people may not have caught it. So I just want to highlight it. And that is, I think it's fine to make these plans. They need to be held before the Lord. And if the Lord decides to interrupt them or change them, we need to be open to hearing that and responding appropriately. And by the way, quickly, not just, dilly-dally about making those modifications. He could decide to adjust it upward. He could decide to say, well, this is actually a season of pruning. So maybe you're not going to grow as much as you thought. And that's all of me. That's okay. But the point is, we're involved in managing something with him. And we really see this as before the fall. Adam and Eve were managing the Garden of Eden. And every day they had a staff meeting with the Lord, who came, walking under the trees in the cool of the day. But they were talking about, okay, what do you want us to do next? And, what's the yield that you're expecting over there? And how many trees need to be planted or whatever? I don't know what they were doing in Eden, but I'm using those as agricultural analogies. And so I think there is a kind of godliness and wisdom in paying attention to the details and holding yourself accountable to a standard that would be acceptable in the outside world of secular business or whatever.
Yeah. One of the things, just thinking through numbers, not as they have to constantly be growing. I think in one of your talks, you talked about up and to the right.
Yeah.
Like that concept, like things growing and things moving forward. But they actually become a discernment process. Our social media, I'll use that as an example because we're doing this right now. We've got, some of our social media activity, we have declining returns on what we're doing. We have less interactions, less activity. And so we're not taking that as, oh no, we're doing something wrong, but we're taking that back to the Lord and asking the Lord, okay, are we doing what we're supposed to be doing? We're doing everything that we feel like we're supposed to be doing, using the best wisdom that we have. We don't have specific revelation on it. But then now we're really praying, okay, so Lord, are you removing favor from this? Are you saying that this is no longer good stewardship of our time because you're not giving us returns in this? And so it becomes a discernment process by looking at those numbers. We're not beating ourselves up and saying, oh no, we're not being good stewards, but it actually becomes a way to be good stewards. Like, wait a second, I've been planting corn and corn's not growing. I think I need to, rotate crops and maybe I'll get some better fruit from what we're doing. And so it allows us to use wisdom and pay more attention to what God is saying in the activity, because everything that happens has God's handprint somewhere. Whether it is, this is open to the enemy's attack and I need to figure out how to get it unopened, or this is no longer having my blessing, or this is what I'm blessing. Like those things that we're constantly looking and discerning and paying attention to what's actually going on. Proverbs talks about a wise person that knows where his flocks are at, how the health of the flocks, and where his crops are at, the health of his crops. And one of the parables that two of us brought up in the Kingdom Business Conference was the whole idea of the talents, right? That just understanding, like there were talents Jesus gave, the King gave his servants things, material possessions, things he put into their hand, talents. So that, not the way we think about talents, abilities, but things that were put into their hand, and their responsibility was to increase them. And somebody just trying to not do anything, but just hold on to what they had because they didn't want to mess it up, that was the one that Jesus rebuked. The ones that actually grew it, they came back and they didn't say, well, I did something, I don't know what happened, but here's what I have. They came back and, Lord, thank you for giving me 5 talents. Here's 5 talents more. Let me give you what I've got. But they knew exactly what it was. They had information, and it was proof of their stewardship. And that's really the issue. And I think that was our main point in the whole thing of kingdom business, is understanding stewardship. Everything we have is a stewardship, whether it's anointing, whether it's spiritual gifting, whether it's our business, whether it's the people that are in our lives, whatever it is, it's a stewardship. And that means that I'm going to have to give an account to the owner, which everything I have does not belong to me. I'm stewarding somebody else's. I'm stewarding God's stuff. I'm going to have to give an account to him for how I've stewarded that. Do I actually know how I've done? And if I'm not paying attention to what's going on in what's under my hand, then I have no idea whether or not I'm actually being faithful or not. Because this idea that I'm just going to do whatever I feel like, and that's going to cause God's blessing to come because, he who's led by the Spirit, it's like the wind, just goes wherever. And, that concept is actually an excuse to be lazy and is a guarantee of having little fruit. And I don't want to have a little fruit. Like, I want to have something beautiful to give back to him. Like, when I show up, I want as many crowns as I can that I can throw at his feet. Not because I want a whole bunch of crowns, but because I want something I can throw at his feet because he's worthy. And I want to have been found faithful in that day. And I'm living for that reward. So everything that I do, am I faithful? And how do I know if I'm faithful? I look at what I've done and what has come from what I've done.
One of the things we always used to say in the companies I worked in, and it was kind of, I didn't bring it, from one company to the next. It was kind of common understanding within the business environment is things that get measured or things that get done.
Yeah.
So there's nothing inherently unspiritual about measuring. That's why I pointed out that even in Acts, it points up, how big was the church at each of these points in time. I think when it becomes soulish and carnal is when people become enslaved to that, and when they lay plans that are not collaborated with or collaborated upon with the Lord as they make those plans.
Or get identity from the results.
Exactly.
Right, because then it becomes an idol.
That's correct.
Like, I'm a good pastor because I have, 1,000 people, or I have 100 people, or I have 5,000 people, or whatever that number is.
That's right.
Or I'm a good pastor. I'm a good leader because my budget is this much. Like, my ministry is successful because my budget is this amount. All of that stuff is idolatry. It's when it's a tool to figure out faithfulness, that's good. When it becomes a way that I get identity, it actually has become an idol. And I think that's probably a good part of the root as to where some of the idea of not making these things the most important, like, people were confronted because of their idolatry, and they didn't realize the principle underneath the confrontation. So they shared the revelation that they got outside of the context. And so it became a law instead of a way to respond to what God was saying to that person because of what was going on in their hearts.
Yep. Very well said. Very well said. Well, let's move on from that and let's talk about things that are going on at Streams, because, when you came in, John Paul was obviously a larger than life type of figure. And I think Streams had to be reconfigured on some level. But you've launched some new initiatives as well in the last couple of years. And so Streams today carries on the legacy of John Paul, but it also very much has your touch and feel to it, your flavor to it. What are you doing with Streams since this is the field you've been given to work?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of pieces. I think last time we were talking, I talked a little bit about Streams Academy and just the idea of growing this place where people can get high-level training and equipping that holds a theological foundation and supernatural activity combined instead of separated. And we're pressing into that actually just about a week right before and right after the business conference. I was recording the first module of phase 2. So we've started the second phase of that module, which is living in spiritual realities. So we're going to go in depth into kingdom. So the first module, I'm talking about the kingdom of God, What are the implications of that? So a lot of what I taught in the kingdom business was stuff that I'd been studying in this, because how do we bring things that are under our authority? And we spend a lot of time understanding authority, because a kingdom is an authority structure. So if we have a kingdom of God, that there's authority, and understanding authority is so essential, and recognizing. So we talk about how to grow your authority, where we get spheres of authority, how to recognize them. But then we talk about the issue of narcissistic structures within ministry, how we create that, how we actually create cultures that lean towards that. So that's that piece. We're going to get into spiritual warfare, bringing in some of the, not exactly, but the concepts that was made more popular recently with Michael Heiser's Unseen Realm. It's not new concepts; they've been around forever. Actually, I was reading some stuff on church fathers, and I can't remember which one it was, but from the 3rd century, that when they talked about spiritual warfare, they would quote out of Deuteronomy a lot, and the Greek Septuagint quoted that verse, that he determined the borders of the nations according to the number of the sons of God. And they would point towards that whenever they were talking about the demonic or the spiritual realm, recognizing that nations are put under spiritual authorities in heavenly places. And what does that actually mean? What does that mean to our lives? How do we live that out? And what does that mean to the kingdom of God? We're going to go into that. That's going to include some deliverance. We're going to talk about inner healing. I mean, we've got a lot. So we're really developing the implications of the things that we've been given from John Paul and taking them to the next level to do it. Was one of the things that really attracted me to Streams. I remember hearing John Paul talking about his desire was that the courses that he did would kind of be entry, but that he would have people that he would disciple that would become kind of like a Delta force. Like they would become the ones that get called on for special missions, that are highly trained, highly equipped to do things for the kingdom. And so we're trying to develop that and unto a new church planting movement, because I really feel like we're at a shift where there's going to be a rise in kingdom communities being launched that are going to carry some new expressions, what God has been doing, and new, not as in not seen before, but different than what is and more like what was, if that makes sense, and bringing that expression to what's going on. So I want to be a part of that, because I can tell that that's what God is going to be doing in the next season. So we want to help that. So we've started to work with groups that are getting started, starting kingdom communities, helping one start up in Inverness, actually, Charity, she's starting a community up there. We've got a group in Forney that we're working with, and then working with existing churches and trying to really release that into the fabric of the church.
Yeah.
That's a lot of what we're doing.
Well, Cross Kingdom is, I think, one of those churches as well. And there's another one, at least one, that you've got in Louisiana that you're working with.
Yep.
So there seems to be some traction with it, and people are excited about it. I'll say, the material I've seen you release, it looks very, very good to me. So I think it's an important role that you're filling as a parachurch organization to come alongside of and assist and facilitate what the Lord is doing in the wider work of the Church of Jesus. So, all right, well, let's transition from there. A little while back, you started to get this very strong interest in inner healing, which to some people, people were asking me, why is John Thomas getting interested in inner healing? He's known for a prophetic, house, and what do these two have in common? And I was like, it isn't obvious to you that these are like, how do you have one without the other?
Yes.
I mean, if you want healthy prophecy and healthy prophetic communities, this is necessary. But people did not get that. And you've been kind of, going down this path for a while, and you've been having a lot of success and fruit from it. But now there's this new book coming out. And so talk to us about your own perspectives on the relationship between inner healing and prophetic ministry. Talk to us about what you've done in the area of inner healing with your own community that you lead, and talk to us about this book and, kind of what its function is.
Yeah. Well, I mean, man, I could go forever. Let me dial down just a little bit. It comes out of the experience that I had with the Lord. I grew up in a very traumatic childhood, traumatic coming into adulthood, became a drug addict. I ended up with demonic visitations for much of my young life. I lived in what a lot of people would call a haunted house, and dealt with that from as long as I can remember. Seeing things moving around, things talking to me, other people in the family, like it was very tangible activity. And, that leads to the addiction and the other things that kind of all tied in with trying to escape that activity. And I came to an encounter with the Lord. And when that happened, the level of freedom that I experienced and the experience of being loved and how that changed everything. I went from my hope, my great dream in life was that I would grow old sitting on the front porch on a rocking chair, smoking a doobie. Like that's what I thought would be success, And,
exactly 180 degrees out of phase with everything else you've said on this show.
Right. Well, exactly. Well, because I had no hope. I had no trust in myself. I had no belief in myself. I had shame. I had pain. I had bondage. Like that was my life until God showed up. And now all of a sudden I feel loved, and I start to realize how different my life is. And so I started trying to figure out, well, how can I help other people? And I would have this thing that would just happen to me. I would be, driving down the road, or sitting praying or worshiping, or, having a conversation. And I would go back into a memory from my childhood. And this is before I was discipled. So I didn't know any of this stuff, but it's just what happened. I'd have this memory from my childhood, and I would automatically pray through that memory. I would think about what I did that was wrong. I would start repenting. I would think about what other people did to me that was wrong. I would start forgiving them and praying for their salvation and blessing them and asking God to bring healing. And I started changing. I started shifting. And it was my main way of relating to God. I would hear his voice, and he would lead me to healing. And when I started hearing God's voice, I would have people that would, hey, I've got this weird stuff happening in my house. Do you know how to do with, something about that? And I knew how to handle that stuff. So I don't know. I don't even know how I knew how to handle it, but I knew how to handle it. So I'd be going over to people's houses, and I walk into a room, and I would know what had happened in that room. And I'd ask them, hey, is this happened in this room? Hey, the people that were here before, was there this going on? And I would be hearing these things. We would deal with the issues, and the activity would change. It would shift. And I didn't realize that hearing from God was separate than bringing the kingdom to bear in whatever situation that I found myself. If that meant that I'm with a broken heart, then I'm going to hear God, figure out how to bring the kingdom, the will of God, the love of God into that. And there's going to be healing. If I'm in a defiled place, I'm going to get rid of the demonic. I'm going to hear God. He's going to tell me what to do, and I'm going to respond. And so in the midst of this, I run into John Paul and he starts talking about hearing from God. I didn't know that that was outside of healing. I just thought that was part of the package because that's who God was. He redeems and he saves. So fast forward, I don't think John Paul thought of it as different either, because, when he started his ministry, I don't know if you know the story, but when he got kicked out of the corporate realm, God told him to go ask this business person to use a particular part of his offices, and he would renovate them for free if he would let him use them for free. And the guy agreed, and he said to put up a sign that said Deliverance Clinic out on the door. And so he put Deliverance Clinic on the door, and he's like, well, I don't know what is deliverance. It's, well, when you get rid of demons. Well, how do you do that? Well, somebody's going to come and stand in front of you, and you're just going to say what I tell you to say. Oh, I can do that. Like, I can hear you. And so that's how he started his ministry. People would come in, he'd hear God, he'd say what he said, people would get free. And he ended up getting so busy, like he was booked out for months. And then he started doing these monthly gatherings, and then he started traveling and speaking, and he became known as this prophetic guy. But it started out of that initial jump with that deliverance. One of his main fathers is John Sanford, who is kind of like a distant father, grandfather. Like, I met him and he's prayed for me a couple times. So I honor and love him, who, he has this Elijah mandate, right? The spirit of Elijah shall come, and you will restore the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of the children to the fathers. So the restoration of hearts and reconciliation in relationship is the definition that God gave to prophetic ministry. And I think understanding prophetic ministry as anything other than that is the reason why we've got the mess in the prophetic that we've got. Like, people think of the prophetic as a way to get secret information rather than as a way to bring the kingdom of God so that there's peace and reconciliation and restoration of hearts. So all that coming together, it's always been a focus. Like, it's always been a focus. It's becoming more obvious because I'm talking a lot more. And I'm realizing how many of the issues that we're facing in the church are because hearts aren't healed. John Sanford, when he started his ministry, God told him that he was called to raise up an Elijah generation, that he was going to be pouring out prophetic into the church, and he was going to do that. So he started, how can I train the prophetic? And God started showing him that people that prophesy without healed hearts are only going to wound themselves and wound other people. And so he wouldn't even teach his prophetic school unless you'd gone through Ministry 101 and Ministry 201. You had to go through, which was not just learning how to do it. You actually went through the healing as part of the training. And so you had to get hearts healed before he would even teach you the prophetic. And that, there's this value in this inheritance, and that's all part of the inheritance of Streams. It's who we've always been. You take the art of hearing God, it's about the process that God brings you through for transformation, dealing with curses, dealing with strongholds, dealing with generational iniquity, understanding the dark night of the soul, like all of this stuff. That's right in the root of our foundational course that John Paul started this whole thing with. And so we're taking those implications and just trying to take them further. So I had somebody give me a call and like, hey, we're doing this podcast where we're interviewing people about their ministry, and your name was suggested. So I met with them, and come to find out, like, all their people they're interviewing are all inner healing people. Like they had at the time Rochelle was leading Elijah House, they'd had the Kilstras from Restoring the Foundations, and then Dan and Cindy, Lee and Cindy, who are leading Restoring the Foundations now. Carl Lehman with the Emmanuel approach, Father Andrew with Heart Sync, like all these different ones, Donna De Silva from Sozo, all these different inner healing ministries. And so we started, I connected with them, and they had this vision to see the inner healing movement start to create relationships so we could flow together. So we got together. I felt like this is something good. So, you know, we're part of getting this thing started. And out of that, this idea, well, what would happen if we wrote a book that shared what is our ministry? How do we heal hearts? How did this get started? And what's the kind of the keys that God has given us that we use to bring healing to people? And so we had, I think it's 10 or 12 different ministries that put together a chapter, and they're like, hey, would you write a chapter for this? I'm like, well, I don't actually have an inner healing model other than I just hear God and do what he says. So, but they asked me to do it. And so I wrote a chapter in that, and we ended up where it's going to be coming out in November of 2022. So that's, you know, a month from the recording of this. It's going to be coming out, and it's, you know, Streams of Healing, which is all about the different inner healing modalities and what they have in common, and then, you know, what the differences are, but in a very generous, like, we're all streams that are flowing from one river, which is very, very fitting for who we are as Streams Ministries, which is kind of funny.
Man, I love that. I can't wait to read it. And when does it come out? When does it drop?
November. So in about a month.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's
so
exciting.
the thing that'll be real, I read it and wrote a review of it for John. I guess I got it in last week. But the thing that I was most impressed with was each of the streams speaks in its own voice, i.e. they wrote their own piece. No one's trying to evaluate them as a third party. They kind of gave their main tenets of what they do. And in one volume, you can look side by side at what these things are, and it'll give you the ability to gauge, oh, this might be more effective here. This might be more effective there. Oh, I don't know anything about that one. I better do some reading and get some exposure to that. Maybe I should incorporate that into my ministry. And so, you know, there was something kind of like this, sort of, in the early inner healing movement when it was first being started, because people like Agnes Sanford and Ruth Carter Stapleton and Tommy Tyson, and there were others. I don't mean to exclude anyone. I'm just giving a few sample names. But they kind of knew each other, and they would do conferences and things together. And so there was that sort of collegiality that went on. And then that was in the 60s and 70s. Well, this is the 21st century that we're in, and it was like 40 plus years ago. And effectively, well, all those people are dead now. And many of their works, although they're still very, very powerful and worthy works, are not even remembered. People don't read these books. They don't go look for them. I mean, you can, if they're still in print, you can find them on Amazon, or maybe you can download them on Kindle or something. But many of their works they're not even discussed in modern ministry circles. Yeah. And so this book is giving us another chance to kind of regroup in a similar way, with, you know, many different personalities that are involved in this kind of ministry. So I think it's a very interesting book. I think it's really worthy, and I'm super excited that you got to be part of it. Yeah,
me too. I feel like I don't know. It's somehow I got included, and I'm really glad that I did. Yeah. Well, one of the beautiful things about it is all the people that wrote a chapter all have relationship. So, you know, we've got a lot of, you know, if you will, second generation. So Restoring the Foundations was started by the Kilstras, but it's now being headed up by Lee and Cindy Whitman. They wrote the chapter, Lee and Cindy wrote the chapter for Restoring the Foundations, what they learned from the Kilstras, how it started, and then what they're doing now and what their model is. You know, the Marjorie, who is heading up, and I would say her last name, but I slaughter it. It's a really cool name that I don't pronounce well. That's heading up Elijah House now. You know, we have that chapter that's in there because John and Paula have both passed away, and yet the ministry is still going on in what they taught and what they released. But then you've got some new things like, you know, Father Andrew. I don't know are you familiar with Heart Sync at all?
Yeah,
have you heard of that? Yeah, I mean, it's not as popular kind of in the charismatic world, but it's very charismatic in its foundations. It's inner healing deliverance, but he teaches it in such a way that there's a whole gambit of the evangelical church that is now, they've been given inner healing in a language that they can accept and receive. And it's becoming an integrated church, part of the ministries of a lot of more traditional churches and more of the evangelical churches, which is a beautiful, beautiful thing. So it's, there's so many of these different things that are happening that we don't even realize how much is available.
Right. Well, they say that the field of knowledge, of human knowledge, is doubling every 18 months at this point. And
wow,
that's an astounding thing to think that here we are at the end of 2022, and literally the collective knowledge of mankind, of humanity, is twice what it was in January of 2021, when we were still all bunkered down with COVID. So it's just like, it kind of boggles the mind. And it's a function of, there's more people doing more thinking. We've got the collective computing power, and, there's just all these things that drive that. But the point is, it's going on. And so, maybe out of this, some of this gets used for evil, but let's see some good come out of it. Books like this. Yeah. Well, I think we've about covered everything we were going to talk about. So is there anything I should have asked you and didn't think to ask you that you want to tell us about? Otherwise, we'll wrap it up.
Not that I can think of. There's always something, but nothing that I think is essential.
All right, good. So, John, thanks for joining us once again on God is Not a Theory. And I'm really encouraged at all that's going on with you and through you. And I look forward to doing some more events together. It's always great when we get together and do joint ministry.
Hey, John, real quick for me and for other people that want to know, the school, the class, all of that sort of stuff you're talking about doing phase 2. Is there a phase 1 live? Is there somewhere that they can go now?
Yeah. So phase 1, it's not a quick process. It's actually a discipleship thing. So, but it's available. It's an online with a live mentoring. So online videos that you watch and live mentoring. And module 6, you don't have to take them in order. You have to take phase 1 before phase 2, but any of the modules in phase 1 take out of order. Module 6 starts November 1st, and it is on our website. So if you go to streamsministries.com, has all of our information, but look for the tab that says training, and you'll see Streams Academy there, and it'll take you right to that website. You can get all the information. And then in January, we're going to start again with module 1. And so each module is a 2-month period with 2 or 4 opportunities for Q&A. So you do the videos and you have some homework, and then you get together with a live teacher and talk about it, discuss it, ask any questions that you have. What did you learn from the homework? What's, how does this apply to your life? And that happens every couple weeks. So yeah.
Cool.
Streamsministries.com.
Awesome. Well, all right. Well, thanks so much for joining us, and thank you, Ken, and always thank you all for listening. And we'll be right back here next week with another piping hot episode of God is Not a Theory with Ken Fish.
We've recently updated the Orbis Ministries app with Ken's free teaching archive. You can click on the link in the description of this podcast to download today.